She had the split-level house, the colored television, the station wagon, and 3 beautiful children. She also had a prescription bottle hidden behind the flower arrangement. By 1968, a single little yellow pill called Valium had become the best-selling medication in America, prescribed to women at twice the rate of men. They called it Mother's Little Helper, and doctors handed it out like candy for nerves, for tension, for the problem that has no name. But the real story isn't about addiction. It's about what an entire generation of women was trying to escape, and what happened to the children who watched their mothers disappear 1 milligram at a time. This was the American Dream, 1960s edition. A husband climbing the corporate ladder, a wife keeping the house spotless, and a pill that kept her smiling through all of it. Valium arrived in 1963, and within 5 years it was the best-selling drug in the United States. By 1970, doctors were writing 29 million prescriptions a year, overwhelmingly for women. The diagnosis was nerves, tension, the housewife syndrome, as if unhappiness was a pathology that could be cured with a little yellow tablet. That same year, a journalist named Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminine Mystique. She had interviewed hundreds of housewives and discovered what the pharmaceutical ads never showed. The women said things like, "I feel empty somehow, incomplete." Sometimes she would say, "I feel as if I don't exist." Friedan called it the problem that has no name. These were not sick women. They were smart, educated, and capable, told their highest calling was to create a perfect home. When they woke up at 32 and felt nothing but dread, they blamed themselves. And a medical establishment that had long treated women as hysterical and fragile prescribed the one thing that kept the silence intact. But the pills did not solve anything. They postponed the reckoning, and inside millions of homes, a generation of children grew up watching their mothers fade away in plain sight. They learned to tiptoe past tense silences, to pour their own cereal while mom stared out the window, to never say the wrong thing that might trigger another nervous breakdown. They absorbed a lesson their mothers could never put into words. The sunny suburban ideal was a lie. So, what did that do to them? How did those children, the first latchkey generation, carry that quiet trauma into the rest of their lives? And what does it tell us about a world that still struggles to listen when women say they are not okay? It begins in 1963 with a book that landed like a bomb and the first cracks in a picture-perfect illusion. It begins in 1963 with a book that landed like a bomb and the first cracks in a picture-perfect illusion. Betty Friedan was not a radical. She was a suburban housewife herself, a Smith College graduate who had dutifully left her career as a journalist to raise 3 children. But she kept asking why she and her friends, educated, capable women with beautiful homes, felt a creeping emptiness they could not name. In 1957, she surveyed her Smith classmates. The results were so raw and honest she paused for years before publishing. When The Feminine Mystique finally hit bookstores in February 1963, it sold more than 1 million copies in the first 3 years. It was dangerous because it gave words to an experience millions of women had been told was their personal failing. What were the words a woman would say? Friedan wrote, "I feel empty somehow, incomplete." Or she would say, "I feel as if I don't exist." Sometimes she blotted out the feeling with a tranquilizer. Those last 7 words cut through the silence like a razor. Because by 1963, America had built an entire infrastructure designed to convince women that their sole purpose was the perfection of their homes and families, and an equally powerful industry ready to medicate them when that purpose turned out to feel hollow. To understand how we got there, you have to rewind to 1945. World War II ended. Millions of soldiers came home. Women who had worked in factories and offices, who had tasted independence and a paycheck, were told to return to the kitchen. And they did, by the millions. The GI Bill financed suburban developments like Levittown, New York, rows of identical Cape Cod houses on former potato fields. The message from magazines, advertisers, and popular psychology was unified. A woman's highest calling was to create a beautiful home, to support her husband's career, to find fulfillment in the smell of fresh laundry and the shine of a waxed floor. The marriage age dropped, the birth rate spiked. Between 1946 and 1964, 76 million babies were born in the United States. The baby boom required a labor force of mothers, and those mothers were expected to perform their role with a smile. Here is what the magazines did not print. By the late 1950s, a quiet crisis was spreading through American kitchens. Married women were pouring themselves second drinks before noon. They were admitting themselves to hospitals for what doctors politely called nervous exhaustion. They were asking family physicians for something to take the edge off, and doctors had exactly what they needed. In 1955, a drug called Miltown arrived, the first mass-market tranquilizer. It became a sensation, written up in gossip columns, passed around at cocktail parties. Pharmacies ran out. By 1963, an even more powerful compound was ready. Hoffmann-La Roche introduced Valium, and the company made one absolutely brilliant strategic decision. Instead of marketing the drug only to psychiatrists, they targeted the general practitioners, the family doctors, the men with a waiting room full of housewives. The advertisements were shockingly direct by modern standards. A woman stares at a pile of laundry, her expression tight. The headline reads, "In anxiety and tension." Another ad features a woman holding a telephone in one hand and a child in the other, her face strained. The copy reads, "Because the pressures of everyday living often produce anxiety and tension." The ads never mentioned that the pressures might be legitimate. They simply promised a chemical solution to the feeling that something was wrong. And the feeling was the problem. Doctors, educated in the 1940s and 50s, had been trained to view women as fundamentally fragile. Medical textbooks described housewives as prone to hysteria, emotional instability, and somatic complaints. When a woman sat in a doctor's office and said she felt empty or overwhelmed, she was not seen as a person responding rationally to an irrational set of expectations. She was seen as a patient displaying symptoms of anxiety neurosis. The prescription pad was the cure. Valium was clean, modern, scientific. No odor of whiskey, no stigma of institutionalization. Just a little yellow pill. The numbers tell the story better than any editorial. In 1965, American doctors wrote 500,000 Valium prescriptions. In 1970, they wrote 29 million. By 1978, the number would reach 88 million, a nearly 18,000% increase in 13 years. Valium was prescribed to women at twice the rate of men. Some studies estimate that by 1980, 20 to 30% of American women were taking some form of tranquilizer. And this was not an underground phenomenon. This was pop culture. In 1966, the Rolling Stones released a track called Mother's Little Helper. It opened with the now iconic line about a little yellow pill, and the lyrics sketched a portrait that was bitingly accurate. Mother needs something today to calm her down. And though she's not really ill, there's a little yellow pill. She goes running for the shelter of her mother's little helper. The song captured the quiet desperation of a routine. Kids are different today, I hear every mother say. Mother needs something today to calm her down. The track was not an obscure B-side, it was a charting single. And somehow, the culture absorbed the message and moved on, treating the medicated housewife as a joke, not a symptom of something rotting at the foundation. But here is the thing the song left out. That little yellow pill had teeth. It created dependency. It masked symptoms without addressing causes. And when women tried to stop taking it, they discovered a withdrawal that was genuinely terrifying. Panic attacks, tremors, seizures, in severe cases, Valium withdrawal could kill. Yet doctors routinely told patients the drug was safe, non-addictive, a simple aid for nerves. The drug companies funded research that minimized the risks, and so women stayed on the pills for years, sometimes decades, believing that they needed the medication to function, never suspecting that the medication itself was making them sick. Meanwhile, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was spreading through American households like a secret past between friends. Women read it in the bathroom, on the living room couch, after the kids had gone to bed, a highlighter in hand, underlining sentences that felt as if they had been torn from their own private thoughts. Friedan argued that the entire ideology of feminine fulfillment through domesticity was a mystique, a collective delusion, that kept women trapped and isolated. She documented the problem that has no name, not as a sign of individual weakness but as a rational response to a society that denied women any meaningful purpose beyond motherhood. The book did not solve everything overnight. Many women who read it were still taking Valium. Many were too busy to join the nascent women's movement. But the book planted a seed. It told women they were not crazy, and they were not alone. It cracked open the door that a generation of activists would eventually kick down. But while mothers read Friedan in silence and refilled their prescriptions in shame, something else was unfolding in the background. Something no one was tracking yet. Inside those perfectly maintained split-level homes, a generation of children was watching. They were learning lessons no one intended to teach. Lessons that would not surface for decades. Imagine a 6-year-old girl in 1965. Her mother picks her up from school, drives her home to a spotless house. Mom pours a glass of water, opens a prescription bottle, swallows a pill. Then she sits on the couch and stares out the window. The girl learns to be quiet. She learns that her mother is fragile. She learns that whatever is happening, it must not be spoken about at dinner when Dad comes home. Multiply that little girl by millions. Those children absorbed an emotional truth they could not articulate. Something was wrong with the adults, and the solution was not talking. Not changing anything, just swallowing something and carrying on. They learned to suppress their own needs to avoid upsetting a mother who seemed one wrong word from a nervous breakdown. They learned to manage atmospheres, to read rooms, to parent themselves, and sometimes even to parent their parents. Exactly how did that shape them as they grew? What happened when those children became teenagers in the 1970s, when they entered the workforce, when they became parents themselves? That is the part of this history almost never examined. And it is where the story turns from a tragedy about one generation into a quiet inheritance passed down through decades. But before we can understand what those children carried forward, we have to go deeper into what their mothers were actually living through. The surface image, the Valium ads, the television housewives, the calm suburban streets, was a carefully constructed set. Behind it was something much rawer. Something that began to crack wide open in the late 1960s, as women who had been medicated into silence started finding the voices they had been told they did not need. And the first question they asked would change everything. What if the problem wasn't in our heads, but in the system that put us there? What if the problem wasn't in our heads, but in the system that put us there? That question did not come from politicians or academics. It came from the women themselves, in living rooms and church basements and consciousness-raising circles that started forming in the late 1960s like underground networks. Women sat in folding chairs with coffee cups in hand and said things they had never said aloud. They described the same hollow feeling Betty Friedan had documented. But now they went further. They talked about what happened after the feeling got too loud. The doctor's visit, the prescription pad, the yellow pill. One woman in a Chicago suburb said she had been on Valium for 6 years and could not remember a single day of it. Another in Long Island described her withdrawal. I tried to stop, and my hands shook so bad I couldn't hold my baby. My doctor said that meant I really needed the medication. A third in San Francisco broke down as she admitted she had been giving her daughter crushed bits of her own pills to calm the child's tantrums, because that was what the pediatrician suggested. These were not isolated confessions. They were repeated thousands of times, in thousands of rooms, until the women started to understand something none of them had been able to see alone. Their suffering was not a collection of private breakdowns. It was a public health crisis being managed by men who refused to name it. The medical establishment had a doctrine. Women who complained of persistent unhappiness were diagnosed with anxiety and neurosis, a label that placed the pathology inside the woman. The solution was pharmacological. But what the women were describing, the emptiness, the rage, the sense of disappearing, mapped perfectly onto something else. It mapped onto the lived experience of being intelligent, ambitious human beings told that their highest purpose was to keep a floor clean enough to eat off. The diagnosis was wrong. The cure was making them sicker, and there was a word for what was happening to them that the doctors almost never used: addiction. Throughout the 1960s, Hoffmann La Roche marketed Valium as a safe, non-addictive alternative to older sedatives. The company's sales force trained general practitioners to see the drug as a gentle aid, not a chemical leash. The detail men, as they were called, left samples and glossy brochures in doctors' offices across America. The brochures featured serene women in sweater sets, children playing quietly in the background. The message was clear. Valium restored balance. It helped women function. It did not cause dependence. That message was a lie. Inside the company's own research files, which would not see daylight for another decade, there was evidence that Valium caused physical dependence at prescribed doses, that withdrawal could be severe, and that long-term use was generating a hidden population of addicts who had no idea they were addicted until they tried to stop. But in the 1960s, no one outside the industry saw those files. The first person to really blow the door open was not a doctor. She was a journalist named Barbara Seaman. In 1969, Seaman published a book called The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, which exposed the dangers of oral contraceptives and forced congressional hearings. That book changed the way women thought about the medications they put in their bodies. But Seaman and other feminist health activists soon realized the birth control pill was only one front in a much larger war. By the early 1970s, the same women who had marched against the war in Vietnam, who had picketed for civil rights, who had started reading Our Bodies, Ourselves when it appeared in 1971, they began asking harder questions about the sedatives in their medicine cabinets. They started comparing notes. They discovered that their symptoms were not unique, and they began demanding answers from the institutions that had promised to care for them. The drug companies responded with a familiar tactic. They called the women emotional. They suggested that concern about addiction was itself a symptom of anxiety. They funded studies that purported to show Valium was safe when used as directed, ignoring the millions of women who had been using it as directed for years and could no longer function without it. But the activists had an advantage the companies did not anticipate. They knew how to organize. They knew how to talk to the press, and they were very, very angry. In 1973, a group of women from the National Organization for Women staged a demonstration outside the headquarters of Hoffmann La Roche in Nutley, New Jersey. They carried signs that read "Valium creates dependency" and "Stop drugging the housewife." They demanded the company release its internal research on addiction. The New York Times covered the protest. For the first time, the phrase "mother's little helper" appeared in a hard news story, not a rock song. The demonstration was small, maybe 40 women, but the coverage sent a jolt through the culture. Suddenly, the secret was out. Valium was not just a cultural punchline. It was a national scandal waiting to be fully exposed. That exposure arrived in February 1975. Senator Edward Kennedy, chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Health, announced hearings on the abuse of prescription drugs. The star witness list included representatives from Hoffman-La Roche, federal regulators, and a handful of former users who were willing to testify publicly about their experiences. One of those witnesses was a woman from New Jersey named Ruth Carter. She was 43 years old, married to an accountant, mother of 4. She had been prescribed Valium in 1966 after the birth of her second child. When she told her doctor, she felt overwhelmed. For 9 years, she had taken 10 milligrams every morning, 20 at night. When she tried to stop, she experienced convulsions. Her doctor told her the seizures were evidence of a pre-existing neurological condition, not withdrawal. He put her on an even higher dose. Ruth Carter sat at the witness table in Washington, her hands trembling visibly, and told the senators what her doctor had never told her. "Nobody said I might become dependent," she said. "Nobody said the drug could cause seizures if I stopped. Nobody told me that the medication meant to help me function would eventually take away my ability to function without it." Behind closed doors, the drug company executives were already preparing their defense. They argued that Valium was among the most thoroughly studied medications in history, that addiction was rare, that the tiny number of women who abused the drug were outliers with pre-existing psychological problems. The company's lawyers and medical directors dismissed Ruth Carter's story as anecdotal, not scientific. But Kennedy's committee had subpoenaed documents, and buried in those documents was a pattern that the company could not explain away. Internal memos showed that Hoffman-La Roche had known about withdrawal seizures since the early 1960s. Sales representatives had been instructed to reassure doctors that Valium was safe, even as the company's own scientists were flagging growing evidence of dependence. One memo from a company researcher in 1968 warned that patients attempting to discontinue Valium often experienced severe anxiety, insomnia, and in some cases, grand mal seizures. That memo was never shared with prescribing doctors. When the committee's chief counsel confronted the company's medical director with that document, he stammered. The footage aired on the evening news. America watched a pharmaceutical executive struggle to explain why his company had withheld safety information from the physicians treating millions of women. The hearings lasted 6 months. They produced thousands of pages of testimony, and by the time they concluded, the official narrative had shifted irreversibly. Valium was not a benign helper. It was a dependence-producing drug that had been marketed aggressively to a population of women who were systematically misdiagnosed and chemically silenced. But here is what the hearings did not address. They did not ask what happened to the children of those women. They did not examine how growing up with a medicated mother shaped a child's emotional development, their sense of safety, their understanding of what it meant to be an adult. The senators were focused on regulatory failure. They were not looking at the living rooms and kitchens where the real damage was spreading silently. And that silence was about to be broken in a way nobody expected. In 1976, a year after the hearings, a small study appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Child Psychiatry. The researchers had followed a cohort of children whose mothers had been prescribed benzodiazepines during pregnancy. The findings were alarming. Elevated rates of birth defects, developmental delays, and behavioral problems. But the study received almost no press attention. The major media outlets were still covering the political fallout of the drug hearings, and a study about children seemed like a footnote. But for the women who read those journals, the nurses, the social workers, the therapists who had been part of the consciousness-raising circles, the study was a thunderclap. They started asking a question the hearings had ignored. If Valium was damaging to unborn children, what about the children who spent their entire childhoods watching their mothers numb themselves into silence? There was no research on that question. No one had ever studied it. So the women began studying themselves. Grassroots groups in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco started collecting oral histories. They interviewed adult children of the Valium generation, people who were now in their 20s and early 30s, the first wave of Gen X and the tail end of the baby boom. The stories they recorded were not clinical data. They were raw, unfiltered testimony, and they revealed a pattern so consistent, it was almost unbearable. The children described mothers who were physically present, but emotionally unreachable. They talked about learning to read their mother's moods by the rattle of the prescription bottle. They remembered mornings when mom was bright and engaged, before her anxiety built to the point where she needed another dose, and afternoons when she was glazed and distant, staring at game shows without really seeing them. One woman, interviewed in 1978, described her childhood this way. "My mother was always there. She drove carpool. She made dinner. She was at every school play. But I never once felt like she actually saw me. It was like she was performing motherhood from inside a fog. And I was just a prop she had to keep in frame." Another interviewee, a man whose mother had been prescribed Valium when he was 8, recalled a terrifying episode. One day she ran out of pills and the pharmacy was closed. She started shaking and crying and screaming at us for no reason. I hid in my closet until my father came home. The next day he took off work to get her prescription refilled, and she went back to normal. And nobody ever talked about it again. That was when I learned that we did not talk about things in our family. These stories were collected in mimeographed newsletters and shared at community meetings. They did not make the New York Times. They did not reach the Senate floor. But they formed the foundation of an underground understanding that would take decades to surface in. Mainstream psychology. The Valium generation had raised a generation of children who learned to be hypervigilant, to suppress their own needs, and to treat adult emotional states as a threat to be managed rather than a connection, to be trusted. But while the activists were gathering those stories, the pharmaceutical industry was already executing its pivot. The Valium backlash had made the drug a liability. Hoffmann-La Roche moved aggressively to protect its market share by launching a new, supposedly safer benzodiazepine. In 1978, the company introduced Ativan. The marketing campaign was careful. Ativan was positioned as a modern, lower-dose alternative for the new, more informed female patient. The ads featured women in offices now, wearing blazers, carrying briefcases. The housewife was out of fashion. The working woman was the new target, and the prescriptions kept flowing. Valium had peaked, but the benzodiazepine class continued to grow. By the early 1980s, American doctors were writing more than 100 million tranquilizer prescriptions a year, a significant portion still for women. The lesson of the Valium crisis, it seemed, was not that drugging women into compliance was wrong. The lesson was that the industry needed to be more sophisticated about how it did it. At this point, in 1982, something crucial happened that connected all of this to the next generation in a way few people noticed at the time. The first major longitudinal study of divorce's impact on children was published by Judith Wallerstein. It found that children of divorce carried long-term emotional scars. But hidden in the data was a related finding that got buried. The children whose mothers had been chronically depressed or anxious, and often medicated, suffered outcomes just as severe as children whose parents had divorced. Living with a mother who was physically present but emotionally absent turned out to be its own form of rupture. But society was not ready to process that. The dominant narrative about the 1960s housewife was still one of prosperity and ease. The backlash against the women's movement had already begun, framing feminists as angry and ungrateful. The idea that millions of suburban mothers had been victimized by a collusion of patriarchy and pharmacology was too radical for the mainstream, and the idea that their children had been silently damaged by that experience was completely off the radar, except in the lives of those children. They were growing up now, They were entering therapy. They were joining adult children of alcoholics groups and realizing their experiences were eerily similar, except the substance was different. They were starting to write and talk, and the first whispers of a concept called adult children of dysfunction were forming. The bridge to what happened next is not a single event. It is a slow awakening that began in the late 1980s and gathered force through the 1990s as the children of the Valium generation started looking at their own parenting, at their own anxieties, at the ways they had internalized the silence of their childhood homes, and they began to ask the question that would eventually reframe the entire story. What if the trauma of the 1960s housewife didn't end when the Valium wore off? What if it just changed shape and passed down? But before we can answer that, we have to look squarely at the institution that made it all possible, the medical system that not only prescribed the pills, but created the very definition of normal womanhood that made the pills necessary. And we have to ask, when the women tried to warn the world, when they organized and testified and demanded accountability, why did the system essentially shrug and hand them a different prescription? Because the real pivot of this story is not about Valium, it is about power. Who gets to name whose suffering is real? Who gets to decide whether a woman's unhappiness is a sickness to be medicated or a legitimate response to an illegitimate demand? And that question is about to explode in a way that will connect the suburban kitchens of 1965 directly to the therapy couches of 1995 and far beyond. The explosion came from an unlikely source, and it did not look like an explosion at first. It looked like a small group of women in a church basement in Boston, 1983, passing around a photocopied questionnaire. They were not researchers. They were daughters, now in their 30s and 40s, who had spent years trying to find language for something they felt in their bones but could not prove, that their mother's Valium prescriptions had not just sedated a generation of housewives. They had fundamentally shaped an entire generation of children. The church basement group called itself the Mother's Legacy Project. It was the brainchild of Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, a clinical psychologist who had grown up in a pristine Connecticut suburb in the 1960s. Her own mother had been prescribed Valium when Eleanor was 7, after a doctor described her complaints about domestic life as anxiety neurosis. For the next 12 years, Eleanor watched her mother dissolve. Not dramatically, not all at once. The dissolution happened in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. A smile that grew slightly mechanical, a voice that flattened, an attention span that narrowed until it included nothing beyond household logistics and the television schedule. When Eleanor was 19, her mother sat in a lawn chair for an entire Saturday afternoon, did not move until the sun went down, and when Eleanor asked if she was all right, she said, "I am fine, dear, just resting." Eleanor knew she was not fine. She had never been fine. But the family had a rule about asking follow-up questions. At the age of 42, Eleanor Hargrove realized that most of her clients, especially the women, were telling her variations of the same story. They had grown up in beautiful homes. Their mothers had been dutiful and present. And yet, when she asked them to describe their childhood emotional landscape, they circled around the same phrases. She was there, but she wasn't really there. I always felt like I was taking care of her. I never learned how to name what I needed because I could see that she couldn't give it, and I didn't want to make her feel worse. Eleanor noticed something else. Her clients who were children of the Valium generation shared a specific set of symptoms not recognized in any diagnostic manual. They were hyper-responsible to the point of exhaustion. They had difficulty identifying their own emotional needs, often unable to answer the question, "What do you want?" without deferring to someone else's desire. They suffered from a pervasive sense of guilt that attached itself to everything, from taking a sick day to ordering the more expensive item on the menu. They had learned as children that their survival depended on monitoring the emotional weather of adults. And now, as adults, they could not turn that surveillance off. Dr. Hargrove started the Mother's Legacy Project as a curiosity. What if she could systematically collect these stories? What if there was a pattern that could be documented? A thread connecting the prescription bottles in 1965 to the therapy couches in 1985. She gathered 50 women, then 100, then 300. She trained interviewers, not in clinical diagnosis, but in the simple act of listening without judgment. The interviews were recorded on cassette tapes, which piled up in cardboard boxes in her office. By 1987, the project had collected more than 800 testimonies from adult children of chronically medicated mothers. The majority of the mothers had been prescribed benzodiazepines, Valium, Librium, Ativan, but a significant number had also been given barbiturates, amphetamines for weight control, and combinations that no ethical doctor would prescribe today. Some mothers had been on multiple medications simultaneously, their doctors balancing uppers and downers like a chemical tightrope act. What the interviews revealed was not simply that the children felt neglected. It was that they had developed a specific psychological adaptation, a survival strategy that wired their brains differently during critical developmental windows. Eleanor gave it a working name: suppressed needs syndrome. The children of the Valium generation had learned, before they could speak in full sentences, that their emotional needs were secondary to their mother's fragility. They became tiny adults, managing their own feelings so that mom would not have a bad day. They understood, with the clarity of children who never miss a thing, that love in their household was conditional, not conditional on achievement or obedience, but conditional on not requiring anything from someone who had nothing left to give. But it got more complex than that, and here is where the story takes a turn that even Eleanor did not anticipate. Many of the daughters and some of the sons told another story alongside the first one. They described the moments when their mother's medicated fog would briefly lift. Maybe the prescription was late, and she would become agitated, irritable, suddenly present in a way that was terrifying because it was unpredictable. Or maybe she would talk, really talk, for a few hours about her own thwarted dreams, her rage at her husband, her bitterness at the life she had been funneled into. The children would listen, fascinated and frightened, absorbing confidences that were too heavy for their ages. They became their mother's therapists, priests, confidants. And then the fog would descend again, and mom would return to her quiet routine, and the child would be left holding secrets they could not process. This created a double bind. The child had to be invisible enough not to burden mom, but also available enough to serve as an emotional container when mom needed to spill. The result was a generation of adults who had no coherent sense of what it meant to give and receive care. They gave too much, or they could not give at all. They were drawn to partners who replicated the dynamic, distant, needy, unavailable, or all three. They walked into adulthood with a script they had never chosen, written by a pharmaceutical industry and a cultural system that had convinced their mothers they were sick and their children that they were fine. Eleanor Hargrove presented her preliminary findings at a small academic conference in 1988. The room was only a third full, but a young psychologist named Jonathan Marks was in the audience, and he was electrified. Marks was a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health who had been studying attachment patterns in infants. He knew the literature on how maternal depression affected child development, but the Hargrove data pointed to something more specific: the effect of chronic medically induced emotional blunting. It was not just depression. It was a mother whose affect had been chemically flattened, and that flattening happened during the years when children were supposed to learn, by mirroring their caregiver, how to feel and express their own emotions. Marks approached Hargrove after the talk. He told her about a line of research he wanted to pursue. If you could study the adult children of the Valium generation with neuroimaging, You might find evidence that their limbic systems, the parts of the brain that process emotion and attachment, had developed differently. But neuroimaging was in its infancy, and funding for a study that dared to critique the pharmaceutical industry was non-existent. So Hargrove and Marks did what researchers on the fringe often do. They kept gathering data. They published small articles in journals with limited readership. They spoke at community events and clinical training seminars. They built a body of evidence that the establishment would eventually be forced to recognize. Meanwhile, the story was about to be completely overshadowed by a new narrative from the drug companies. And this is where the cynical genius of the pharmaceutical industry becomes almost unbearable to recount. Because at the exact moment when the children of the Valium generation were reaching adulthood and starting to seek help for their inherited anxiety and depression, the industry rolled out a new class of medications, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The most famous of them, Prozac. Prozac was introduced in 1987. Its marketing campaign was brilliant. It was not for housewives. It was for everyone. It was not a sedative that flattened emotion. It was promoted as a medication that restored your true self. The ads featured men and women, young professionals, active seniors. The copy promised to correct an imbalance rather than sedate a symptom. Within 2 years, Prozac was on the cover of Newsweek. By 1990, American doctors were writing 10 million prescriptions annually for SSRIs. And a significant number of those prescriptions were for the very people who had grown up, watching their mothers disappear into a Valium haze. This is the moment that turns the story from a historical tragedy into an active inheritance. The women who took Valium in the 1960s were told their unhappiness was an anxiety disorder. Their daughters, now adults, were told their anxiety was a chemical imbalance. The language changed, but the fundamental transaction remained. If you are suffering, swallow this. The suffering itself, its roots in social arrangements and unexamined power structures, remained untouched. And here is the thing that Dr. Hargrove and others in her network began to notice in the early 1990s. The daughters who were now on Prozac were not just medicating their own anxiety. They were raising children of their own. They were parenting, often without any model of what emotionally present parenting looked like. They were determined not to be like their mothers, distant, foggy, checked out, but they had no other template. They overcorrected. Some became intensely anxious about their children's emotional states, hypervigilant in a different way, desperate to be present, and often overwhelming their kids with a form of anxious attunement that felt like pressure. Others found themselves slipping into the same fog they had sworn to avoid, not because of pills necessarily, but because the overwhelm of parenting without a secure internal foundation was so immense that they would dissociate without chemical assistance. The cycle was not broken. It was mutating, but just when this story seems like an unbroken line of damage, a counter-current emerged, and it is essential to understand it because it changes everything about how we interpret the legacy. In the mid-1990s, the first memoir began appearing by women, and they were mostly women, who had been children of the Valium generation. One of the most influential was Diane LeClaire's The Yellow House, published in 1996. LeClaire grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia. Her mother took Valium, then Ativan, then Xanax, sequentially, for 22 years. LeClaire's memoir was not just a catalogue of harm. It was a map of what she did to get free. She wrote about entering therapy at 45, about confronting the silence in her family, about the terrifying process of learning to name her own emotions, starting with simple ones like, I am sad, or I am angry, and building a vocabulary that had been denied to her. She wrote about the moment she realized she had been unconsciously reenacting her mother's chemical coping with her own daily wine habit, and how she stopped. LeClaire's memoir sold slowly at first, then caught fire through word of mouth and book clubs. Women across the country saw themselves in its pages. But they did not just see victims. They saw someone fighting back, recovering something that had been stolen. The book inspired a wave of similar memoirs and, more importantly, a wave of community-based healing groups that looked nothing like the consciousness-raising circles of the 60s, and everything like them at the same time. These groups called themselves Daughters of the Quiet Mothers, History Keepers, the Reclamation Project. They were secular and spiritual, intellectual and emotional, and they all operated on a single principle: you cannot heal what you do not name. By the year 2000, the Mother's Legacy Project had evolved into a formal nonprofit. Eleanor Hargrove had retired, but the organization continued under new leadership. It had compiled more than 3,000 oral histories. It had published 3 books. It had begun training therapists in a specific modality designed for what was now being called secondary chemical attachment disruption. The research was finally catching up to the anecdotal evidence. A longitudinal study out of the University of Minnesota, published in 2001, found that adults whose mothers had been prescribed benzodiazepines for more than 5 years during their childhood exhibited elevated rates of anxiety disorders, avoidant attachment patterns, and difficulties with emotional regulation, even after controlling for other variables like socioeconomic status and family structure. But there was a surprise hidden in that data, and it reframes everything we have been talking about. The study also found a subset of adult children who tested as securely attached, emotionally regulated, and psychologically resilient. When the researchers went back to examine what distinguished this group, they discovered something that Hannah Hargrove would have understood immediately. The resilient group had one thing in common. At some point in their childhood or adolescence, they had been given an alternative narrative. A grandmother, an aunt, a teacher, a neighbor, a book, a therapist, someone or something had told them, explicitly or implicitly, that their mother's emotional state was not their fault, that the fog was not normal, that there was a world outside the medicated silence. They had been given the gift of reframing. They learned that their mother's suffering was not a shameful family secret, but a reflection of a sick system. That re-narration, the researchers wrote, was protective in a way that almost nothing else was. This finding led to a question that would dominate the conversation in the 2000s. If re-narration was protective, then how do we ensure that every child of a medicated or emotionally absent parent receives that re-narration? And the answer required the culture to look at itself in a way it had been avoiding for 40 years. Because by the 2000s, the story was no longer just about Valium. It was about a broader pattern that had started with Miltown and Valium, continued through Ativan and Xanax, and then expanded into the SSRIs, the ADHD medications, the entire apparatus of psychiatric medication prescribed to people who might be responding rationally to irrational environments. The sons and daughters of the Valium generation were not just inheriting their mother's anxiety. They were inheriting a medical system that had not acknowledged its original mistake, and a cultural system that still found it easier to medicate distress than to change the conditions that produced it. But the system was about to face an accounting it could not dodge. In 2003, a document leaked from the files of the American Psychiatric Association. It was an internal memo from a committee tasked with revising the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The memo acknowledged, in language that was scholarly but unmistakable, that the diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder had been applied disproportionately to women since its introduction, that social role strain was consistently misdiagnosed as pathology, and that the intersection of gender norms and diagnostic practice warrants urgent examination. The memo was not meant for public consumption. It was published by a whistleblower on a newly popular platform called the Internet, and within weeks, it had been downloaded tens of thousands of times. Advocacy groups seized on the memo. They demanded hearings. They demanded that the APA investigate how many women had been misdiagnosed and inappropriately medicated over the previous 50 years. The APA stonewalled at first, then appointed a task force with no enforcement power. The hearings never materialized, but the memo changed the conversation. The women who had been testifying in church basements and community centers for 20 years now had a footnote from the establishment, a quiet admission that something had gone wrong, even if no one was willing to take responsibility. The scandal never fully broke into the mainstream in the way the Valium hearings had in 1975, but it simmered. And as the 2000s rolled on, a new generation of researchers and writers began connecting dots that had been scattered for decades. They connected the Valium housewife to the Prozac mom, the Prozac mom to the Adderall child, the sedating of women to the stimulant dosing of their children, a closed loop of pharmaceutical management that treated the family as a unit of chemical adjustment, rather than a web of relationships that needed healing. The central revelation, the one that changes how you hear every story in this history, was articulated most clearly by a historian named David Hertzberg in the 2010 book Happy Pills. In America, Hertzberg argued that tranquilizers like Valium did not simply treat a pre-existing epidemic of female anxiety. They helped produce it by converting diffuse social grievances, the isolation of suburban life, the infantilization of intelligent women, the denial of meaningful purpose, into a personal pathology that could be managed with a pill. The pharmaceutical system not only failed to solve the problem, but actively deepened it. It taught women that their legitimate distress was a malfunction. It taught their children that emotional pain was not something to be understood and addressed, but something to be medicated into submission. And that teaching did not stay in the 1960s. It threaded into the DNA of American consumer culture, into the very idea of what it means to feel bad and what you should do about it. It shaped the self-help industry, the talk show confession, the pharmaceutical advertising that now fills television screens. The legacy is so pervasive that it is almost invisible. You breathe it in like air. By now, the children of the Valium generation have children who are adults. The chain stretches across 4 generations. And the final unfolding of this story, the part that brings us to the present moment, is not about what the pills did to the mothers, or even what the mothers did to the children. It is about what the children have done, and are still doing, to break a cycle that was designed, intentionally or not, to be unbreakable. It is about a reckoning that is happening right now, in therapy offices and recovery groups, in parenting books and online communities, in the quiet decisions of mothers who refuse to repeat the silence they inherited. So the question that began with a little yellow pill in 1963, with a book that named the problem that had no name, with a medical establishment that prescribed compliance instead of listening, that question lands finally in the laps of the people who lived through it from the other side. And what they did with it, what they are still doing with it, is the hardest part of the story to tell, because it refuses a simple ending. It is an ending that is still being written in the lives of millions of families, every single day. So the question that began with a little yellow pill in 1963, with a book that named the problem that had no name, with a medical establishment that prescribed compliance instead of listening, that question lands finally in the laps of the people who lived through it from the other side, and what they did with it, what they are still doing with it, is the hardest part of the story to tell, because it refuses a simple ending. It is an ending that is still being written in the lives of millions of families every single day. When Diane LeClaire finished writing The Yellow House, she was 52 years old. Her mother had been dead for 6 years, from a combination of liver failure and what the coroner listed as accidental benzodiazepine overdose. LeClaire had spent her 40s in therapy, had divorced a man she loved, but could not stop trying to fix, had raised 2 sons while constantly second-guessing whether she was present enough. Too present, too anxious, too distracted. She had tried to do everything differently from her mother, and in many ways she had. She showed up at every soccer game. She talked about feelings. She told her sons they could always tell her anything, and she meant it. But something still felt off, some ghost of performance lingering behind her parenting. She described it once as trying to improvise a dance when you had only ever seen. People sit perfectly still. You move, but constantly fear you are doing it wrong. Leclerc's memoir did not offer a triumphant conclusion. It offered something more honest. After describing her childhood with a mother who spent 22 years chemically absent, after detailing her own struggles with alcohol and emotional unavailability, after naming the damage and tracing its roots, she ended the book with a scene. She is in her kitchen, her adult son's visiting, and the younger one says something that hurts her feelings, and instead of swallowing it, instead of ignoring it, she says, "That actually hurt me. Can we talk about it?" The son apologizes. They talk, and the family moves through a minor conflict without anyone dissociating or reaching for a substance, or performing brittle politeness. She writes, "That was it. That was the revolution." 2 minutes in a kitchen on a Thursday, and I realized the entire legacy of my mother's pain, and her mother's pain, and all the silence that was supposed to protect us. It ended in that moment. Not because I was perfect, because I finally had the courage to be imperfect and stay present. That quiet moment in a kitchen is the ledger on which the final accounting of this story is written. Not in congressional hearings, not in pharmaceutical settlements, not in academic papers, though all of those matter. The ultimate payoff happens in the small, unrecorded decisions of the adult children of the Valium generation, deciding in real time whether to repeat the silence or break it. The legacy shaped Gen X parenting in ways that researchers are only now quantifying, and the patterns are surprising. When Eleanor Hargrove's successors at the Legacy Project conducted a major follow-up study in 2012, they surveyed over 1,500 adults who had grown up with chronically medicated mothers and who had gone on to become parents themselves. The results painted a complex picture of what intergenerational healing actually looks like, and it was not the simple rebellion against the 50s housewife that popular culture often imagines. Roughly 40% of the respondents described their parenting style as intentionally emotionally present, characterized by verbal affirmation, active listening, and a deliberate effort to validate children's feelings. This group was significantly more likely to have been in therapy themselves, to have read parenting books, and to describe their own childhood experiences as a negative template, a model of what not to do. They reported higher levels of communication with their children than their mothers had with them, and they were more likely to apologize when they made mistakes. This was the group that most closely matched the cultural narrative of Gen X conscientious parenting, the generation that read Reviving Ophelia and Raising Boys and brought their toddlers to play therapy. But another 30% described something more ambivalent. They reported significant anxiety about parenting, a fear of repeating their mother's emotional absence that paradoxically made them over-involved, over-watchful, prone to catastrophizing every childhood setback. Some of these parents described themselves as helicopter parents before there was a word for it, hovering not out of a desire to control, but out of a terror that if they looked away, they might miss a sign that their child was suffering in silence the way they had. This anxiety, while born of love, could be its own form of emotional burden on children, a new expression of the old dynamic in which the child's well-being becomes the locus of the parent's unresolved trauma. And then there was a smaller but significant group, about 15%, who replicated the emotional distance of their mothers, though often through a different mechanism. Some had internalized the lesson that emotional needs were dangerous or shameful, and they raised their children with a kind of stoic pragmatism, providing materially and logistically, but struggling to connect on an emotional level. Others had turned to substances themselves, continuing the chemical cycle in a new generation. The final 15% fell into a category the researchers called disconnected but stable. Relationships with children that were functional but lacked intimacy, a kind of truce with the past that neither healed nor compounded the original wound. The study's most striking finding, however, was not about parenting style at all. It was about narrative. The single strongest predictor of whether an adult child of the Valium generation would raise securely attached children was not whether they themselves had been in therapy, not their education level, not their income. It was whether they had constructed a coherent story about their own childhood, a story that acknowledged the pain, understood its origins in systems larger than their mother's individual failings, and integrated that understanding into their sense of self. The people who could say, "My mother was medicated because she was trapped in a system that gave her no other options, and that hurt me, and I am carrying that hurt, but I am also choosing to parent differently." Those people were breaking the cycle. The people who could not talk about it, or who told only a story of blame or a story of denial, were still transmitting the wound, even if they fervently believed they were not. This finding vindicated what the underground groups had been doing for 30 years. The Daughters of the Quiet Mothers, the Reclamation Project, the hundreds of small circles where women told their stories and reframed their past. These were not just support groups. They were crucibles of intergenerational healing. By helping adult children construct a coherent narrative, they were physically changing the trajectory of the next generation's brain development. The science of attachment, which had once described the damage, was now describing the cure. And the cure was, in its essence, profoundly simple and terrifyingly difficult. It required telling the truth. It required looking at a mother, or the memory of a mother, and holding two realities at once. She was both a victim of a system that medicated women into submission, and someone whose choices caused harm. It required acknowledging that a person can be both sympathetic and responsible, that understanding the context does not erase the pain. This was the emotional calculus that the Valium generation had been denied, the capacity to hold complexity, and teaching it to their children was the great reparative act. By the 2010s, the cultural conversation had shifted enough that these ideas were beginning to surface in mainstream parenting discourse. The phrase gentle parenting, which drew on attachment theory and trauma-informed care, entered the lexicon. Books on breaking family cycles became bestsellers. Generational trauma became a topic of TED Talks and social media threads. The children of the Valium generation, now in their 50s and 60s, were becoming grandparents, and some of them were using their hard-won wisdom to support their own adult children as they became parents. The quiet that had once blanketed their childhood homes was being replaced by something noisier, messier, more honest. But if the story ended there, it would be too clean. And history does not resolve in neat arcs. The uncomfortable truth is that the pharmaceutical system that produced the Valium crisis never truly reformed. It adapted. The number of American women taking psychiatric medication today is higher than it was in the 1960s, though the drugs have changed. Benzodiazepine prescriptions have fallen from their peak, but they are still written tens of millions of times a year. SSRIs, SNRIs, atypical antipsychotics, stimulants, the pharmacopoeia has expanded, and women remain the primary recipients. The diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder remains disproportionately applied to women. The time pressures, the impossible standards, the structural inequities that made the 1965 housewife reach for a Valium have not disappeared. They have shape-shifted into the working mother's second shift, the mental load, the burnout culture that tells women they should be able to do everything and feel grateful for the opportunity. And here is the twist that makes this story not just a historical cautionary tale but an active question for anyone listening right now. The daughters of the Valium generation who broke the cycle were able to do so because they had a coherent narrative. But their daughters and sons, the grandchildren of the original housewives, are growing up in a culture that has not yet resolved the fundamental tension. They see their mothers working, striving, sometimes struggling. They see a culture that still markets chemical solutions to emotional pain, now under the more sophisticated language of wellness and brain health. They inherit a different set of problems: the phone instead of the television, the Adderall instead of the Milltown, but the underlying structure is eerily familiar. Emotional distress is still frequently treated as a malfunction requiring a product, rather than a signal requiring a reckoning. The grandchildren are just beginning to enter adulthood. They are the first generation to grow up with widespread awareness of intergenerational trauma as a concept, to have access to therapy apps and mental health, TikTok, and language about attachment styles. They are also the most anxious generation on record, and their rates of psychiatric medication use are unprecedented. The question that Eleanor Hargrove asked in a church basement in 1983, "What does this legacy do to the children?" is still being asked, and the answer is still unfolding. So what does it mean, then, to say that this story has a payoff? It means that the payoff is not a single conclusion, but a directional shift. The Valium era produced a generation of children who had no narrative for what was happening to them. They grew up in silence. Their achievement, the thing they gave to their own children, was not perfect parenting. It was language. It was the permission to say, "Something is wrong here, and it is not because you are broken." That permission, once given, cannot be fully retracted. It moves through families, through communities, through culture, changing the terms of the conversation even when the conditions that produced the original crisis persist. In 2019, a woman named Patricia Kim published a paper in the Journal of Family Psychology that few people outside the field noticed. She had interviewed 39 grandmothers, mothers, and daughters in Korean American families, asking about the transmission of emotional norms. But in her final chapter, she devoted a small section to a related project she had undertaken after her own mother's death. Her mother had been a Valium user throughout Patricia's childhood in a Chicago suburb. Patricia described the experience of reading Diane LeClaire's memoir in the winter of 2017, 3 months after her mother died. She wrote, "I sat in my office and cried for an hour. Not because the book told me anything new about my mother, because it told me I was not alone. And for the first time in my life, I understood that my mother's absence was not a reflection of my worth. It was the shape of her cage. That understanding did not excuse everything. It did not undo the years of loneliness. But it let me stop carrying a weight I had never named. And I realized that was the real inheritance, not the wound. The wound was always going to be there. The inheritance was the story that made the wound bearable, and the decision to tell it. That paragraph, buried in an appendix of an academic paper, is as close to a final resolution as this story will ever get. The mothers of the 1960s were not given the language to name their suffering. The children of those mothers had to invent it, and in the inventing, they created something that the original system never intended. A lineage of truth-telling that moves forward in time, each generation adding its own chapter, each chapter refusing the silence that came before. The little yellow pill is still manufactured. It is still prescribed, but it no longer has the power to keep a family quiet for 30 years. That is the payoff. That is what the dark side of 1960s suburban motherhood turned into, once the children who saw it all had the courage to speak. And the story, still unfinished, is now in the hands of their grandchildren, who are just beginning to ask their own questions. What they do with it is something we will all be living through together. So where does that leave us? Right now, in a world where the grandchildren of the Valium era are building their own adult lives, the little yellow pill is no longer a cultural icon. It has been replaced by a rotating cast of brand names, each promising a cleaner, safer, more targeted relief. But the fundamental architecture of the problem has not changed as much as we might want to believe. Women still report higher rates of anxiety and depression than men. They still carry a disproportionate share of the mental load, the invisible labor, the emotional management of entire households. And they are still prescribed psychiatric medications at nearly twice the rate of men. The numbers in a CDC report from 2020 look different from the numbers in a Senate hearing in 1975, but the shape of the disparity is hauntingly similar. The condition that Betty Friedan called the problem, that has no name, has not been solved. It has been renamed and remarketed, dressed in the language of serotonin imbalances and self-care. But its roots in social isolation and impossible expectations remain stubbornly intact. Yet something has changed, and it is the one variable that the pharmaceutical industry cannot manufacture and cannot suppress. The silence has been broken. The children who grew up in those picture-perfect homes, who learned to tiptoe past their mother's medicated fog, did something that the system never anticipated. They started talking. Not just to therapists, though that mattered, but to each other, to their partners, to their own children. They built a vocabulary for the experience of growing up with a parent who was physically present and emotionally unreachable. They gave it names: emotional neglect, ambiguous loss, secondary attachment disruption. They normalized the idea that a good childhood on paper could still leave deep wounds, and that those wounds were not proof of personal failure, but evidence of a cultural failure. To support the people who were doing the most essential work, this reframing is arguably the most significant psychological development of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and it happened almost entirely outside the institutions that had failed the original mothers. It happened in memoirs and support groups, in online forums and community centers, in the small conversations between friends who recognized each other's stories. It was a grassroots reclamation of the power to name reality. And once something is named, it cannot be fully unnamed. The grandchildren of the Valium generation are growing up in a world where the vocabulary of emotional attunement, attachment styles, and generational trauma is part of the cultural water supply. They may be anxious, overwhelmed, and over-medicated in their own ways, but they are not silent. They possess a narrative inheritance that their grandmothers were denied. That inheritance is fragile, and it can be squandered, but it exists. There is a risk in telling this story that it will be heard only as a tragedy, a catalogue of damage inflicted by a corrupt industry on vulnerable women and their innocent children. But that is not the full picture. The full picture includes the resilience of the women who, even while medicated, found moments of clarity and connection. It includes the fathers and grandparents and neighbors who offered alternative stories. It includes the activists who picketed pharmaceutical headquarters and testified before Congress. And most of all, it includes the adult children who refused to accept that their own emotional limitations were the end of the story. They did the hard work of therapy, of self-examination, of awkward conversations with aging parents. They chose, imperfectly and repeatedly, to be more present with their own kids than their mothers could be with them. That choice is not a small thing. It is the engine of intergenerational repair, and it operates on a scale that no longitudinal study can fully capture. What does this mean for the person watching right now? If you see your own family in this history, it might mean that the unease you have carried for years has a context larger than your own choices. It might mean that the distance you felt from a parent who seemed perpetually distracted was not a reflection of your worth, but a symptom of a system that failed her. It might mean that the anxiety you feel when you try to name your own needs is not a personal flaw, but an inheritance. And inheritances can be examined. renegotiated, and sometimes returned to sender. None of that undoes the past, but it can change the meaning of the past, and meaning is not nothing. Meaning is how we locate ourselves in the flow of time, how we decide what to carry forward and what to lay down. The story of the suburban housewife and her little helper is ultimately a story about power, the power to define whose suffering matters, the power to prescribe the terms of a good life, the power to silence or to speak. The drug companies had power, the doctors had power, the magazine editors and television producers had power. For a long time, the mothers had very little, but their children, in reclaiming the right to tell the story, exercised a different kind of power. They rewrote the script. They refused to inherit the silence. And that refusal, multiplied across millions of families, is the counterforce that keeps this from being simply a tragedy. If the past 6 decades have taught us anything, it is that no pill can resolve the human need for meaning, connection, and purpose. The Valium era promised a chemical shortcut to domestic tranquility and left behind a generation of hollowed-out mothers and hypervigilant children. Subsequent pharmaceutical waves have made similar promises with more sophisticated language, and they have produced their own complicated legacies. The solution, if there is one, does not lie in better drugs or more precise diagnoses. It lies in the slow, unglamorous work of building lives and communities where emotional distress is met with listening rather than a prescription pad, where the struggles of parenting are not pathologized but supported, and where women in particular are not told that their unhappiness is a malfunction but are asked what they need and actually heard. That transformation is not complete. It may never be complete, but it is underway, advanced by the people who grew up in the silent houses and decided that their own children would know a different reality. They are not perfect parents. They make mistakes. They overcorrect. They struggle with the very anxiety they hoped to spare their kids. But they talk. They apologize. They stay present when presence is hard. And in those small, unrecorded acts, they are doing something that no pharmaceutical intervention can achieve. They are proving that the cycle can bend, that the inheritance can be rewritten, that the dark side of any era need not be its final chapter. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to think about the quiet histories in your own family, the things that were never said, the patterns that might stretch back further than you realized. And if you want to understand more of these hidden histories that shape the present in ways we rarely notice, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We release new deep dives every week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for sitting with the hard parts of the past long enough to see how they might lead somewhere different. The conversation continues.